Welcome to The Commute, a Bible study podcast designed to turn your commute into an opportunity to grow in your faith. Whether you're sure of what you believe or you're not sure what to believe, this podcast is designed to help you better understand who Jesus is, what the Bible's all about, and how that applies to your life today. I'm your host, Pastor Matt, and I'm excited to dive into this week's episode of The Commute. Hey, welcome to The Commute. I'm Pastor Matt.
I'm Pastor Casey.
And if you saw the Facebook Live last week, or if you caught up, or actually earlier this week, or if you caught up with our updated episode that we just posted, then you know today we're talking about Matthew and Judges, which is, of course, naturally everybody talks about Matthew and Judges at the same time.
Of course.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is Matthew chapter 5 this week is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And that's actually kind of the reason I thought it would be fun for us to talk about Matthew and Judges at the same time. Because, you know, when you're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, I don't know what your experience has been, Casey, but my experience has been people sometimes say, well, the Sermon on the Mount is a guide for how you should live. And I think there's aspects of that definitely true. But if the Sermon on the Mount is only a guide to how you should live and not an expression of the depth of the law and the reality that we all fall short, then the Sermon on the Mount becomes a crushing thing.
Oh, no doubt about it. If that is just, if you're only on the Mount as, hey, these are a few good guidelines for life, I would say as soon as you try to put those into practice, you will realize that maybe they aren't the kind of good guidelines that you're hoping for, because as you said, they will crush you. If it's just something you're doing to better yourself, you're missing something. And obviously what we would say is the Sermon on the Mount is a whole new way of being in the kingdom ruled by Jesus. And it's only through Jesus that this kind of this kind of dramatic reshaping of God's law makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, and here's the reason I think it's fun to couple it with Judges. Because in Judges, what you see is this picture of God and how he lovingly walks with imperfect people who constantly walk away from him. For example, in Judges chapter 2, it says this. It says, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say to you, I will not drive them out before you." That's the other people that would become a thorn in the side. "But they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you." Now, notice what's really interesting is God doesn't say, well, you broke your end of the deal, so I'm breaking my end of the deal. The reality is God continues to follow through with his promises, even though the people around him don't follow through with their promises. And the cycle of Judges is this constant thing that you hear, like Judges 2:11, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals." So this constant idea that the people of God are following after their own heart, and their own heart is often leading them to do things that are evil in the sight of the Lord. But God doesn't break his covenant.
He doesn't. And now that doesn't mean it isn't without some hardship on the part of the people of Israel. They basically get what they've been asking for, breaking the covenant, and wind up oppressed by surrounding nations, wind up in spots where they are in need of rescue. And that's where it makes God's action even more amazing, that he will come and rescue them repeatedly and send various characters to be the ones through whom he saves them and brings them back to himself.
Well, and I think that's kind of the cool point is it's not without its consequences. And I think that's the issue. When you start getting into things like the Sermon on the Mount and Judges, what you realize is, the heart behind God expressing how things should be is because the way God says things should be work out better for us. Now sometimes we miss that point because sometimes people misread, misinterpret, or misrepresent scripture. And so it makes it sound like the things God's saying aren't in line with the way they could be the best for us. But the reality is, when God sets things up, they're much better. Like imagine if you're reading the Sermon on the Mount and you live in a world where people love their enemies to the extent that they seek to even remove hate from their own hearts. Or you're living in a world where people don't just say, well, God said don't commit adultery, but they ask themselves the question, well, how can I remove lust from my life? So that, the people around me aren't objects, they're people. Man, like how much better would the world be if, just in those couple things?
Yeah, I think you touch on something really helpful for us to consider, that the idea of laws and maybe a word we might be a bit more familiar with are like rules, are not are not there to limit us completely, but instead are there to, in a sense, liberate us from another kind of law. So if I can use this example,
Mhm.
go to some Greek here. It's going to start as English and move to some Greek. We in our day and age are very autonomous kind of people. We enjoy things like autonomy. Now, if you take that word apart, autonomous or autonomy, what it comes down to is basically like auto, and nomos. Auto means self, nomos means law. So to be autonomous is basically to have a self law.
Mhm.
Isn't that the case? That we are the ones who rule ourselves. We are the ones who control our own universe. We are the ones who decide what is best for us. How often do you hear that? And how often I mean I have to admit, how often do I do what's really for number one? But when you think about it, even a self law limits you in a certain way. And what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount and in describing God's law and how you see God's law work throughout the Testament is yes, it is putting some limits on you, but those limits are actually there for your benefit. I mean, think about it. If we were to let self law or our autonomy run to its, what would that be like? It would be chaos. If everyone only looked out for number one, that world would be awful to live in.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out, the world described by the law that Jesus outlines, that's a beautiful world. And now maybe on an individual level, that's really challenging to remove things like hate from your heart, to remove things like lust from your heart. And maybe that feels like, oh my goodness, this is putting just terrible limits on me. But as you've said, when you take into consideration the bigger picture here, yeah, a world where everybody's like that, amazing, just amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like just the way God's trying to set you free. Like I know when you start digging down to the heart, one of the core things we oftentimes think is, well, you know, who knows? Who knows about that stuff? It's not affecting anybody else, just me, which is one of our popular statements in our culture today, right? Hey, it's not hurting anybody, it's just affecting me. But I think too, when you think about it, God's also in a level trying to set you free. Because when you start digging down to the heart issue, well, now all of a sudden you're starting to learn that I'm not in control. My way is not best. God's way is best. So who am I going to trust? Am I going to trust the autonomous self, my own law, what I desire, which is shifting and changing all the time, or am I going to trust the God who is unchanging? Am I going to trust my law, which is loving sometimes and other times not loving to myself or sometimes people around me? Or am I going to trust the God who is so loving, he will literally sacrifice himself on a cross? And then, you think about it, you start digging down to the heart issues, and what you begin to see is you begin to change the motivation. And when motivations change, everything changes. Oftentimes the problem is usually found between our ears. It's in our thinking. And so Jesus kind of shows us how, not just in our actions, but how things stem even from our thinking and our way of being, and how the gospel is something that can sink into those things. And I've just found the other thing is it sets you free. So take anger, for example. Sometimes we hold on to unforgiveness and we think that we're getting even by holding on to bitterness, but really we're not. Sometimes you hold on to things that the other person's just not even aware is still an issue. And so now what's happened? You haven't done anything to that other person that you thought you were doing. And now the only person you've been holding back is yourself. And so, Jesus is calling us in these things for our best. Now here's the other thing I know. It's a wrestling match. It's something that when you read through this, it doesn't matter who you are. There's always something that sticks out to you because you're wrestling against your own autonomous self. Paul says, that this world is a wrestling match between the flesh and the spirit. And really, that's the case. It doesn't matter whether you've been in the faith for 2 weeks or 2 lifetimes, when we're trying to do it on our own, and we're trying to live out this life, there's always that constant tension and wrestling match.
Absolutely. And I think it's also beautiful to consider how this levels the playing field, right? There's nobody can say, well, okay, I haven't actually murdered somebody, so I'm okay. Jesus takes it that step further to equate murder with someone who hates his brother in his heart. And we realize, oh man, none of us can escape failure in this regard. And I think it's that realization that, oh my goodness, the playing field has been leveled for all of us, that the good news of Jesus as someone who has lived this, who has fulfilled this, becomes all the more sweet, and all the more. I think it's in a spot of despair over one's inability to live up to God's standards, that Jesus becomes all the more amazing, because you see that the reason he has come is to raise up those who have been leveled by the leveling of the playing field here.
Well, and that's what's so cool about when Jesus is encountered by who we call the rich young ruler. And I know it pops up in Mark and Luke. I'm forgetting whether or not it pops up in Matthew. I'm blanking on whether it does. But it's really interesting because he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, you know the law. And he says, yep. And he lists it off and he goes, and all these things I've done. And Jesus doesn't press against it, but you read the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm sure Jesus is looking, going, I know you think you've done those things, but you're not going to be righteous for your own sake. And he says, this is good. All you have left is give up everything you own and follow me. And the rich young ruler, it says, leaves sad because he had great wealth. And, Jesus kind of looks and says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. And he's not talking about he's not talking about some place where there's a really tight passageway and a camel struggled to go through. I know that was a popular interpretation for a while. Jesus is literally saying, if you could force a physical camel through the physical eye of a needle, that's how easy it is. And that's why the disciples say, well, then who can get in? And Jesus says, what's impossible with man is not impossible with God. And so I think what we realize in the Sermon on the Mount is our trust is not in our ability and what we can do, and me being able to perfectly reach into my heart and rip out all my false motivations. But our real hope is in the fact that Jesus comes in this world, lives for us, dies for us, and does what we cannot do, so that when we come to something like the Sermon on the Mount, we can realize we're powered by something that's not ourselves. And then we can start living in the example of the Sermon on the Mount without making the Sermon on the Mount the bar that we're trying to reach to earn heaven.
Yeah. The Sermon on the Mount is not something that needs to be earned by you. I mean, it's something that it's expected that you live that way, but realizing that your salvation is not dependent on that is so liberating. And and to go back to your earlier comment, I did check, and it is in Matthew. It's in Matthew chapter 19. You're good to go.
I'm good. Well, hey guys, it's been fun hanging out with you here. I hope you enjoyed Judges. I hope you enjoy continuing through Matthew. If you'd like more resources, definitely jump on the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app. That's the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app. We've got great resources there for you. You can also go to bethlehemchurch.live. And then, of course, if this podcast was an encouragement to you, I want to encourage you, share it out with somebody else that's trying to read through the Bible or was thinking about it and thought maybe it's too hard, because you never know how the things that you share could make a positive impact on somebody's life. So, hey, till next time, it's been a joy hanging out with you guys right here on The Commute.
Thanks for checking out this episode of The Commute. For more information on The Commute or to join the Commute Bible reading plan, simply download the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app or go to bethlehemchurchlive.com/thecommute.